Welcome back, everybody. It's Mr. Christiano reads. We're going to continue with Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Today we're going to read chapters 10, 11, and 12. When we last left off, if you remember, the boys were in detention, and they had come up with actually an invention to help them write as many sentences as possible at one time. I guess it was 8 or 12 sentences. And then they had extra time on their hands, so they were able to make their comic book, The Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilet. So we read their comic, and if you remember, they were in detention because they messed up the invention convention. They messed up everybody's projects, and Melvin Sneedly told Principal Krupp on them, and Principal Krupp put them in detention. So here we go. We're going to continue with chapters 10, 11, and 12 in Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Chapter 10, A Big Mistake. George and Harold sat together in the detention room, reading through their newest comic book and beaming proudly. "We've got to go to the office and make copies of this," said George, "so we can sell them on the playground tomorrow." "We can't," said Harold. "Don't you remember? Principal Krupp said he'd suspend us if he caught us leaving this room." "Then we won't let him catch us," said George. George and Harold sneaked out of the room quietly and crawled down the hall to the office. "Oh, no," said Harold. "There's a bunch of teachers in there. We'll never get to use the copy machine." Said George. "Are there any other copy machines in this school?" "How about the one that Melvin had in the gym?" said Harold. "Oh, yeah," said George. George and Harold crept over to the gym and found the Patsy 2000. "I wonder if this machine still makes copies," said Harold. "Melvin did say that he had made some adjustments to it." "Oh, he probably just crammed a mouse in there to fool us," said George. "It's the oldest trick in the book. I'm sure the machine still makes regular copies." George placed the cover of their new comic book face down on the glass of the screen and pressed start. Uh-oh. If you guys remember, it was the old copy machine, and then Melvin turned it into, any pictures would turn it into a 3D object. Let's see what happens. All at once, the lights in the whole school dimmed, and the Patsy 2000 began to shake and clunk around wildly. Giant volts of static electricity zapped out of the bottom of the machine as a great whirlwind rose from the top. Loose papers and other small objects in the room were sucked into the wind, and they spun above the machine like a raging cyclone. "I don't think it's supposed to do this," shouted George over the horrible noise. Finally, after a series of flashes and a loud zaps, the noise, wind, and sparks stopped altogether. The only sound that could be heard was something groaning and clawing about the inside that bloated, battered frame of the Patsy 2000. "It sounds like something's alive inside there," said Harold. George snatched the comic book from the top of the machine. "Let's get out of here," he cried. Uh-oh. Just then, a small ding was heard, and a full-sized, shiny white toilet emerged from the side of the Patsy 2000. Its teeth were sharp and jagged, and its angry eyeballs glowed with red, swelling veins. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up," cried the evil toilet. Almost immediately, another talking toilet emerged, followed by another, and another, and another. "Yum, yum, eat 'em up," they cried. "Oh, no! Melvin was right! The photoatomic transmogobulating yakofruction zissafranasmizer really does create living, breathing, three-dimensional copies of one-dimensional image. Harold cried convolutedly. I've got an idea, said George. What? asked Harold. Run! Cried George. That's the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11. The Invention, Convention, Detention, Suspension. George and Harold screamed and ran out the gym door, closing it tightly behind them. Aha! Yelled Mr. Krupp, who was just coming down the hall. You boys left the detention room. You know what that means, don't you? It wasn't our fault, cried Harold. Too bad, Mr. Krupp shouted with delight. You boys are officially suspended. Uh-oh. What are they to do? Wait! Cried George. You've got to listen. Behind this door is an army of evil, vicious, I don't have to listen to you boys ever again, laughed Mr. Krupp. Now get your stuff and get out of this school. But, Harold stammered. You don't understand. Get out, Mr. Krupp screamed. George and Harold groaned and walked to their lockers to collect their stuff. Gosh, said Harold. In one day, we've gotten a detention, a suspension, and we've created an army of evil talking toilets who want to take over the world. That's a pretty bad day, even by our standards, said George. Oh, well, said George. I just hope things don't get any worse. That's the end of chapter 11. On to chapter 12. Chapter 12. Things get worse. Word spread quickly throughout the office that George and Harold had been suspended. The teachers rushed out to cheer and laugh at the two boys. You're in big trouble now, chuckled Miss Anthrop. I can't wait to call your parents and tell them the news. Let's take their desks outside and chop 'em up, cried Miss Ribble. Let's throw a party in the gym, shouted Mr. Meaner. Uh-oh. Sounds like the teachers are happy that the boys aren't going to be in school. No! Cried George. Whatever you do, don't open the door to the gym. We can do whatever we like, snarled Mr. Meaner as he dashed over to the gymnasium door. Look, I'm opening the door. He quickly opened the gym door. Now I'm closing the door, he said. Now I'm opening the door again, and now I'm An evil toilet had stuck its mouth through the door, snapped Mr. Meaner up, and swallowed him whole. Flush! The talking toilets then pushed their way through the open gymnasium doors and spilled into the hallway. Yum, yum, eat 'em up, said the toilet bellowed. Yum, yum, eat 'em up. Uh-oh. The teachers couldn't believe their eyes. They screamed and ran for their lives. Only Mr. Krupp, Miss Ribble, and George and Harold remained, frozen in fear. They watched, paralyzed, as the talking toilets came nearer and nearer. Finally, Miss Ribble pointed at the toilets and snapped her fingers. Go away, she cried. Go away this minute. But the toilets didn't listen. They moved closer and closer. Finally, Miss Ribble turned and ran. Mr. Krupp, however, just stood there in a daze. George and Harold looked up at him. Uh-oh, said Harold. Did she just snap her fingers? Yep, said George. Now we're really in trouble. And George was right, for at that moment, Mr. Krupp had begun to change. A silly, heroic smile came over his face as he stood defiantly before his foes. "I'll put a stop to thee, you vile villains," he said fearlessly. "But first, I need some supplies." Mr. Krupp turned and dashed to the office. George and Harold ran after him. "Why did Miss Ribble have to snap her fingers?" cried Harold. "Why?" "Never mind that," cried George. "Mr. Krupp is turning into Captain Underpants. We've got to pour water over his head before it's too late." And there you have it. That's the end of chapter 12. So, it looks like the boys have gotten themselves into just a little bit more trouble than they bargained for. They went and made copies on the old copier that Melvin had used to turn objects into 3D objects. And now they have to fight off some talking toilets from their comic that they made. And Mr. Krupp is on his way to the office to become Captain Underpants. Well, hope you guys enjoyed chapters 10, 11, and 12. And can't wait for you to come back for us to continue reading Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets. Have a good one, everybody.